music insiders on the Manchester scene. And while no one seemed interested, Noel would not be deterred. After a mere 2 months of rehearsal, he decided to try them out on stage. But with little buzz, early gigs were hard to come by.
They played the toilet circuit, which is basically the various pubs and dives around the country.
They were playing whatever shows they could get, really crappy bars, and vying for table scraps of attention with probably 30 other Manchester bands.
There's a classic story of they played and literally there was no one there. It was a completely empty room except for the bartender. But Noel remembers it fondly, saying that they actually played an encore.
But after nearly 2 years of grueling rehearsals, it seemed Noel had done the impossible. He turned his band of incompetents into a tight live act with a repertoire of compelling new songs. By 1993, they'd settled on the sound that would be their trademark.
The early 90s, the sound was pretty much grunge, and Oasis were just doing these tight, Beatlesy rock and roll songs. They really leaned toward the pop side of rock. They write hooky choruses, very catchy guitar riffs. Music is fairly upbeat.
By the summer of 1993, Oasis was beginning to build a small following. But the band's quest to land their big break would soon become the stuff of legend.
The story of how Oasis got discovered is now befogged in mythology. It's hard to tell what really happened. It's been told a million times, and everyone's an unreliable narrator with this story.
They went up to Glasgow to play on a bill with a band that they knew from Manchester at the club in Glasgow called King Tut's Wah Wah Hut.
The guys in Oasis drove up there, even though they weren't on the bill. That's sort of how the story goes, and muscled their way onto the stage somehow.
The club owner didn't want to put them on the bill, but Noel threatened to burn the club down. And amazingly, that worked.
It was an astoundingly brazen act that would pay off in a surprising way.
There was a very important guy named Alan McGee, who was the head of Creation Records, in the audience. Creation Records at that time had Primal Scream, My Bloody Valentine. They had a whole roster of very kind of British-sounding guitar bands.
And McGee was just stunned by what he saw. There was this young band with just this incredible energy. They were all cocky and really arrogant, considering the fact that they had no record deal. Nobody on the face of the earth, other than their mom, had really heard of them at this point. And he went to them immediately after the set and said, "Do you guys have a record deal?" Noel said no, and he said, "Do you want one?"
A few days later, the band met with McGee at the Creation offices, and by the fall of 1993, Oasis had landed their very first record deal, but not without some very peculiar conditions.
One of the famous demands on Noel's part was that when, they became huge rock stars, he wanted the label to buy him a chocolate brown Rolls Royce. I mean, we're talking about a band that was choosing at night whether they could drink or eat dinner. It didn't seem like anyone was going to be driving Rolls Royces from the Oasis camp in the near future.
The Rolls would have to wait. First, Oasis had to prove themselves in the recording studio.
When Oasis first started recording Definitely Maybe, they couldn't believe their luck. Somebody was paying them to sit in a recording studio messing around with guitars and drums all day. They thought it was a dream come true. And so they just thought it was a bit of a holiday camp, and they started drinking a lot, and not a lot of work got done.
Noel, he had to kind of wrangle the rest of the band members, and I think Noel had to really be the kind of ringleader and keep everyone organized.
Noel kind of thought it might be a good idea to put them somewhere where it'd be a little bit harder for them to get access to their friends, access to drugs and alcohol. So he ended up moving them to Sawmill Studios, which is kind of like on a remote island.
No one was concentrating. So the idea was, all right, well, if no one literally can leave, then maybe we'll finally get this done.
The plan worked, and recording was completed in just 10 days. Meanwhile, label head Alan McGee pressed Oasis's early demo track Columbia into a 12-inch single. He began slipping it to industry insiders, and the response was immediate. The vinyl single wasn't even available in stores, but BBC's Radio 1 played it 19 times in just 2 weeks. Then, on April 11th, 1994, Oasis released their first official single. Supersonic entered the UK charts at number 31, and their charge up the charts was just getting started.
Supersonic was the first single over there, and I think it made noise, and I think it got attention. It certainly fueled interest as a band that was sounding different. But it wasn't until the third single, Live Forever. Live Forever, I think, was the one that really set them on their path.
Live Forever was Oasis's first top 10 single in the UK. When the full-length album Definitely Maybe hit record stores on August 30th, 1994, it vaulted to #1. In just 4 days, the album had sold an unprecedented 100,000 copies in Great Britain.
The reviewers were ecstatic. The album was pretty much an instant success.
In its first week in England, it was the fastest-selling debut record of all time at that point.
When rock and roll sensations happen in the UK, they happen almost overnight. Oasis, it was clear that they were the rock and roll stars to dominate the 90s within a couple weeks of the release of Definitely Maybe. It was a sensation in England.
It outsold, much to everybody's surprise, the first record from the Three Tenors that was also released on that same day, and that had this huge promotional budget, and these three hugely famous men, and Oasis outsold it, to which Creation Records responded, "There's no match. Three fat blokes singing are no match for Oasis."
Seemingly overnight, Oasis had become England's biggest band in decades, and soon, its most notorious bad boys. In the summer of 1994, with their debut album Definitely Maybe flying from record store shelves, 27-year-old Noel Gallagher and his 21-year-old little brother Liam had taken their band Oasis to the top of the British charts.
Live Forever became the dominant single of the summer in England, and the country was poised for Oasis mania.
Definitely Maybe had this crazy, intense, angry punk energy and these beautiful, soaring, kind of stadium-ready melodies.
They sold out this football stadium in Manchester. And one of the really beautiful little romantic touches is the floodlights from that stadium used to illuminate their bedroom when they were kids. And so it was a great moment of triumph for them to fill that same stadium.
Oasis were just working class lads from Manchester, never really had a lot of money in their pockets. Then all of a sudden, and they're on TV shows and magazine covers, and they're just thinking, what on earth has happened here? It was a really quick, sudden rush to fame.
The boys in Oasis wasted no time embracing their status as Britain's biggest rock stars and all the naughty behavior that went along with it.
Oasis's success in the UK was kind of predictable. Predictable in that even though it was an overnight success, they took to it like moths to a flame. They embraced every cliche, the booze, the drugs.
I don't think that anyone in Oasis has ever seen a pint they didn't like. They've always been drinkers. I don't think there was ever a period where you would describe Liam or Noel Gallagher as sober. Noel was always trying to talk down the reports that his group were just completely off the rails. So he was telling a reporter about how all those stories about them being so wild and crazy were super exaggerated, and while he's telling this story, from behind him, the reporter can see furniture being tossed out of a hotel window.
To the traditional indulgences of sex, drugs, and rock and roll, Oasis added a third volatile element: violence.
They were traveling by ferry to Amsterdam to play a gig. Liam and Giggsy got into a bit of a ruck with a number of Chelsea football supporters. They ended up in the brig. Meanwhile, Bonehead and Tony, they end up in another fight, and a few minutes later, they get arrested. So by the time the ferry lands in Amsterdam, the entirety of the band, bar Noel, have been locked up, and the gig was canceled.
But they weren't just brawling with soccer hooligans. Some of Oasis's most legendary battles raged between the Gallagher brothers themselves.
There was one show where they were sort of arguing during the show, and Liam comes up behind Noel and hits him in the back of the head with a tambourine and actually drew blood.
They were so evil to each other. I mean, these are brothers who grew up in a really violent household and survived it together. And the way they expressed themselves to each other was definitely through kind of the language they learned as kids.
Liam Gallagher. He has a bad reputation. I mean, he's been in brawls. He's known as being highly confrontational, but he's a very different guy than his brother, Noel Gallagher. You can see why there's friction between them. In fact, Noel joked to me that he's not sure that he and Liam have the same dad.
Right after the release of Definitely Maybe, there was an argument between Noel and Liam in front of a journalist, and it was taped, and some enterprising soul put it out on a single. It was called Wibbling Rivalry.
Wibbling Rivalry was essentially Liam and Noel bickering. It promised lots of fighting and lots of swearing, and it delivered. It charted at number 52, and it was the highest charting interview disc ever in the history of the English charts.
But while fans were eager to eat up anything that the Gallagher brothers produced, others were beginning to hear something strikingly familiar in their music.
The whole vibe around the Oasis camp was this was the resurgence of Beatlemania, but the vibe around the music industry was that this was a direct ripoff of the Beatles. They were getting crucified for ripping off the Beatles as much as they did. Liam so obviously wanted to be John Lennon.
I believe he had a vision of John Lennon, and there's a story about how when he actually visited Yoko at the Dakota, that he kind of felt the cold breath of Lennon in the apartment. To which Noel responded, I think she probably just has the AC turned down really low, Liam.
A few of the Beatles took issue with the fact that Liam saw himself as in John Lennon's shadow. I know Ringo Starr wasn't a big fan of Oasis, nor was George Harrison. Noel said, George Harrison has always been the silent Beatle. He should stay that way.
In the world of Oasis, anyone was a target, even their idols. But they found the perfect sparring partners in their closest rivals, fellow Britpop stars Blur.
Britpop had exploded. The two biggest bands were Blur and Oasis.
The competition between Blur and Oasis, that was a huge deal in the UK at that time. Oasis were these rough, working-class kids from Manchester who saw Blur as these kind of art-schooled, middle-class kids who didn't have the same energy as they did. And there was a war of words. Noel said some very unfortunate things.
There was that especially